Hello, this is Professor Otto von Feigenblatt, academician of the Royal Academy of Doctors of Spain, and it is my distinct pleasure to send you this message all the way from Florida to celebrate this important day, which is the 38th anniversary of ISCE in Portugal. I repeat that I am very honored to be invited to this event, and I apologize for not being able to participate live. But there is a hurricane in Florida, and because of that I had to send this pre-recorded video. My presentation today is the nexus between educational leadership and international development. So I will be talking about education, leadership, and development, and how the three of those elements combine together to basically promote development and growth internationally. So first of all, let me begin the presentation by providing a very brief overview of the history of international development studies. This important field initially focused on economic growth, the idea that the emphasis was on GDP, which is gross domestic product, on the economy growing, on basically how much a country would produce in terms of goods and services. And this approach was very deterministic. Basically focusing on the resources for production implied that whoever controlled resources would basically be able to achieve growth and development. But later on, what started to happen is that even though growth was and still is important, they started to realize, experts and policymakers, that development is a lot more than just simply economic growth. It's a lot more than simply GDP. And then the emphasis moved from the macro level of basically having these economic indicators of GDP, of basically how much was produced by a country, and it started to also move to sustainable development and to the individual. How do institutions, how do people help develop how do they help develop the economy, but not only the economy, but also society as a whole. Something else that, in a way, characterized this initial period of international development studies is that it was very centered on economics. Economics used to be the central discipline in the social studies to study this phenomena that today we know as international development studies. So international development studies is interdisciplinary, and it includes many things. It includes literacy, it includes sustainable development in general, it includes the economy, it also includes health. So basically this idea that holistically we have to move towards a more balanced and equitable society. So originally, everything was about economics, and later on, other disciplines also entered the discourse of international development studies to make it more holistic, to make it more balanced, to make it more truly interdisciplinary. And one of those theories that arose in the late 1990s, basically, is the idea of human security. So now we have the word security here, we have the word human. We said that initially international development was mostly about economics, it was about growth, but we didn't really talk about human beings, we talked about what they produced. So now the debate moved towards the human and the security of the human being. And there are two main elements to this theory, or you could say paradigm, of human security. And that is freedom from want, number one, and the second part is freedom from fear. So basically what this theory is saying and what it combined are two things. One thing is freedom from want. Obviously people do need resources, they do need access to things like healthcare, to food, to supplies. But people need a lot more than that in order to have true security. They also need to have freedom from fear. And this part talks about stability. It talks about having the rule of law. And basically you're combining two things here. You're combining economics, the economy, but you're also combining it with other things such as good governance. Okay, so basically what it's saying is that for a human being to feel safe, for a human being to to have the opportunity to grow and to develop, he or she needs to have the basic needs covered, obviously, but also to have the safety, to have the security provided by the international community, by the state, by the government, in order to achieve those things, in order to enjoy those things. So that was a big change, as you can see, because now we moved from purely economic growth to the idea that, number one, the human is at the center of development, and also that the human beings need a lot more than just dollars or euros. They also need stability, they also need protection, they also need safety. Okay, now there was a very important book that really changed the debate in international development. And the book was actually written by an economist, which is interesting. We said that economists, they played a central role in the early years of international development studies, and they continue to play an important role nowadays. But there was one particular economist, very well known, Amartya Sen from India, who wrote a book titled Development as Freedom. And in this book, he basically tried to reframe the whole idea of development rather than on very purely economic terms of indicators such as economic growth, such as GDP per capita, and so on. And basically, he tried to reframe it saying that development is about freedom. The freedom to do what? The freedom to achieve human potential. So now he basically went from the macro level, which is historically the emphasis of economics, and he started to say, no, I think we're viewing this problem incorrectly. We have to go down to the individual human beings level and basically understand that development is truly about capabilities. It's truly about each human being being able to achieve his or her potential. And how do you achieve that potential? Well, you do so through education and training. And this is a very important nexus, because up to this point, in general, international development had focused on huge infrastructure projects and basically macro level loans, economic indicators, but not so much on this idea that human capital is at the core of sustainable development. And the idea was that development is the freedom to explore and achieve one's potential. So all of a sudden, the emphasis moved away from these huge infrastructure projects of building hydroelectric dams and so on, to this idea that human beings should have access to the creation of opportunities. So development should be about the creation of opportunities and also allowing people to pursue those opportunities. And this is where education comes in, as you can see. So he added this element that education and training, with the proper context, of course, you need to have security, as we said before, and good governance. That is what leads to true development. And well, Amartya Sen is considered to be one of the most prominent economists in the world. He won the Nobel Prize in economics for his work, basically for reframing this whole discourse on international development. Okay, now let's see, how does all of this somehow connect to educational leadership? Well, the reason is simple. Educational leadership is the fulcrum, is the core of freedom. If you think about it, educational leadership is all about enabling education and training. It's about providing a structure and the tools to help students achieve their potential. It fosters economic growth because those students become catalysts for innovation, they create further jobs, they innovate, and so on. They also foster socio-political environment to enable holistic growth. If you think about it, education is not only about a job, it's not only about creating wealth, but it's also about being good citizens. It's also about being good neighbors. It's about being good global inhabitants, if you think about it. And finally, there is no doubt that one of the core functions of a good educational leader is enabling the creation of knowledge. So if we think about it, all of these functions that I have mentioned, they fit perfectly well with the idea of freedom as development, or development as freedom. And at the core of all of that, we have educational leadership. Now let's go down to the individual educational leader. What do you think are the characteristics of the educational leader of the 21st century? Well, I think that one of the main characteristics is definitely creativity. The world is changing. Adaptability to constant change is part of life. Pretty much change is the only constant that we have in the early 21st century. You need to have a lot of emotional intelligence combined with good communication skills. You need to be an integrative thinker. Instead of just analyzing, you need to combine different ideas in creative ways. And one part that sometimes we forget is that you need to be an ethical thinker. With such a complex world, it is more important than ever that we have ethical educational leaders who understand the huge responsibility that they have. The responsibility they have, not only in terms of being catalysts for growth, because yes, it's true, universities and schools do have a very important economic impact, but they also have another important role, which is to create or to foster the next generation of citizens, the next generation of people who will lead society in ethical or unethical ways. At the same time, there are many challenges that we're facing nowadays. It is a very difficult international environment. One of the main challenges that I would say is faced by educational leaders nowadays is ideological polarization. The world is divided, and yes, it's true, it has always been fragmented to a certain extent, but historically there was room for dialogue. Nowadays, sadly, there is a lot of ideological polarization in the news, in the media, and this makes it hard for educational leaders to exercise their historical function, which is to serve as bridges, to serve as basically as mediators between different ideas. Something else that is definitely a challenge as well as an opportunity is the increased pace of change. Change is a constant, but change is happening faster than ever, partly because the world is more interconnected than ever before. One of my favorite definitions of globalization is that globalization is the compression of time and space. And this is something that is happening in every sector, and in particular in education. Education is global, but at the same time is localized. And all of this makes it more complex, it makes it more difficult to a certain extent. And finally, increased diversity. And by diversity, I don't mean the traditional definition of diversity, which is basically people from different countries, different religions. It's not only that. There is even socioeconomic diversity. There is also the issue of different generations with different subcultures. So there is no doubt that the world is waking up to a more diverse world. Educational leaders need to embrace this increase in diversity by somehow adapting to the needs of the many different groups involved in society and, of course, in education. Finally, I would like to provide some recommendations and some best practices that I think would help the leaders of the future, in particular educational leaders. The first thing is philosophical in a way. I think that it is time to embrace change. Sadly, many people are in a way scared of change. Some people try to avoid change because it's considered to be hard work, or maybe some people might feel that change leads to conflict. But instead of trying to reject it, instead of fearing it, I think that today's educational leaders need to embrace it as part of life and as part of their own DNA. Also, it is important to focus on learning rather than teaching, because learning and teaching are not exactly the same thing. We should remember that the goal of education, the outcome of education, should be learning, which is a semi-permanent change in behavior. I mean, that's the academic definition of learning. Teaching is the process, one of the ways in which learning can take place. But it is not the only way. And we need to remember that the teaching part, that basically educators, professors, instructors, and so on, they're only part of the elements that you need in order to achieve learning. And students should be active participants in their own education. Leaders should also serve as catalysts for ideas, rather than as the source of most ideas. And this is also very difficult to do. It is a transformation in the way we view leadership. Leaders should serve as catalysts for ideas. And what that means is that leaders, instead of trying to lead from the top down, they should try to somehow facilitate a dialogue, a conversation, a process that leads to new knowledge and to new ideas. Educational leaders should emphasize interdisciplinary and intersectoral dialogue and cooperation. Universities and schools are not isolated institutions. They have to be embedded in their communities, their nation, and the international community as a whole. In addition to that, we have to look beyond disciplinary boundaries. Biology, social studies, education, they're all interconnected. Because the same way as problems in the real world don't come with labels, this is a health problem, this is an economy problem, our students should also be taught that you have to think in an interdisciplinary way in order to solve complex problems. Finally, a good leader has to foster interorganizational cooperation and dialogue. The world is becoming more competitive, but at the same time, that competition, which now is global and local at the same time, is also a great opportunity for cooperation. And this will require a complete change of mindset. Historically, schools, universities, they view other universities and other schools as competition. Competitions for students, competitions for prestige, competition for media attention. But instead of that, we should view them as partners. There are many opportunities for complementary opportunities and projects in which one institution may have certain resources, while the other institution has different resources, and if they bring them together, they can achieve more than what they can achieve on their own. And that's just one example of how cooperation can take place. So now finally, after that long journey that we took from the early origins of the field of international development studies to some of the traits and characteristics of the 21st century educational leader, I want to give you a few conclusions or main points that I want you to remember from this very brief and general presentation. First one is that localization is more important than ever. And this word combines two things, two concepts: globalization, which we said was the compression of time and space, and localization, which is that things, that basically processes need to be adapted to local needs. Sorry, if you combine those two things, the idea is that global cooperation is necessary, but global solutions need to be adapted to local conditions and to local needs. A leader has to be the coordinator of a research team, and that goes back to that idea that the leader of the 21st century needs to be a good communicator, needs to have good emotional intelligence, needs to understand that relationships are at the core of every organization. Education is central to global sustainable development. We said that education is not only the fulcrum of economic growth, it is the fulcrum of economic development, as we said, innovation, but it is also the beginning of good governance. And finally, educational leaders are at the center of international development. So even though it is not so common to talk about educational leaders such as high school principals, university presidents, as important actors in the field of international development, I think that that is a mistake. I think that educational leaders are at the center of international development, even though many of them might not realize it. So I hope that this very brief lecture that connects education to international development was interesting. Again, I thank the university authorities for including me in this very important event, and I congratulate you for achieving 38 years of academic distinction. Thank you very much for your attention.